Hello everybody, Louis here. Let's talk C#. Today we'll talk about methods, and I'll try to keep things very simple for this video. So we won't go too deep into what the technical elements are around methods. But there are a couple of things that we'll talk about. So essentially there are two kinds of methods. There are methods that we call from an object. Okay, so for example, if I have a string, something like that, I can just do dot toUpper, for example, and I'm calling the toUpper method from a string object. Okay, and we have done this many times before. There are times, however, that you don't call a method from an object. Okay, and when that's the case, you're probably calling a static method. And in this video, we'll talk about static methods, and this is actually what we'll focus on for now. So all the methods that we'll talk about in this course will be static, and we'll talk about non-static methods after discussing classes and all that fun stuff. Okay, so what is a method declaration? Well, so a method has to have a signature. Okay, and essentially a signature is just a fancy way of saying, how the method is defined. We have worked with one method from the beginning of the course, the main method right here. Okay, so this is a method. The main method is a method. Okay, and it actually has a couple of things here. So it has a static keyword. Guess what? We're dealing with static methods, aren't we? So it has a static keyword, defines that this is a static method. It has a void. We never really talked about that, so we'll talk about this today. It has a name, okay, main. In this case, it has parameters. So essentially, all of these things are defined within the method signature. So let's create a new method here. And we'll see how these elements come together to make like a custom method. So let's say that we have a piece of code like this one. Okay, so essentially what I have here is an array of strings. It has all days of the week, and then I have a for each loop that will go through each array element, and I'll display that in the console. So if I just run this code, hopefully what I'm gonna see is a console with all days in a week printed in it. And that's exactly what I have, right? So this is a procedure. It is a simple procedure, but it is a procedure. It is an algorithm or a sequence of steps, right, that I'm taking. So sometimes, however, I just want to make my code a little more organized, for example. So it's not considered to be a very good practice to have a method that's just gigantic. So you probably want to break your method down into a number of smaller methods that have individual responsibilities. That way, your code is more organized, it's more readable, it's easier to troubleshoot, so there are so many benefits to it. So I would say that in my books, it is a good practice to define your own methods, and if you have too big a method, it's probably a good idea to break it down into smaller methods. So having said that, the problem that I have right now is that I have this algorithm. It displays all elements in an array, but maybe I have to carry out this logic many times, and in my books, it is considered bad practice to repeat yourself many times. There's actually a programming principle that talks about that. It's the DRY principle, and DRY stands for don't repeat yourself. So if you have to do the same thing over and over and over again in your code, you should probably have a method or sometimes a class that encapsulates the responsibility of carrying out that piece of logic, that piece of code. And then eventually, if that logic changes, you only have to change one place in your code. You don't have to go through all of your code hunting for the places in which that code existed so you can change the logic there. So you create a method to encapsulate that, so it makes your code not only prettier, but makes it more maintainable. And this is the ultimate goal. So let's say that I want to create a method that displays an array, because I know in my program I will have to display arrays many times. So instead of having these 3 lines of code in here in my main method and just write them over and over again as many times as I need them, what I'm going to do is I'm going to create a new method. And methods in C#, they are defined within a class. So you have to be inside a class to define a method. Okay? And even if those methods are non-static methods. Okay? So probably if you're new to programming, probably this sentence doesn't really make a lot of sense. It will make sense when we talk about classes. So let's just put a pin on it for now, and we'll revisit this topic later. Let's look at how we can write a custom method. So the first thing that we need is the public keyword. Okay? And if you notice up here on line 6, where the main method is defined, it actually starts with a static keyword. It does not have a public keyword in it. So for the sake of the simple applications we're implementing in this course, that's true. You don't need to have the public keyword. It's not mandatory. However, my recommendation is that we should use it. And the reason for that is, if we are familiar with the public keyword, our lives will be simpler down the road when we actually have to use the public keyword. Okay, so let's just throw it in there. It won't hurt us. So it has the public keyword, and what that means is that this method will be accessible throughout other places in my code. Okay, because it's public, means other people can see it. Okay, so that's the first thing. So I said we'll only work with static methods for now, so let's throw in the static keyword as well, much like our main method. Now, in the main method, we also have the void keyword. Okay, so the third keyword that I have here in methods, typically, well, in this case is the third because I have the static keyword there. Sometimes it won't be the third, maybe it'll be the second. It really depends on how you're declaring your method and what your method is supposed to be. But that specific keyword there, what it's specifying is that this method won't return anything. Okay, so let's talk about that for a second. Sometimes there are methods that will return something. Okay, so for example, if I write a method that doubles a number, that method will return a number because I should take a number from the user, I should do that number times 2 and return the result. Okay, in that case, a method like that will return a number, maybe an integer, maybe a double. In this case, because I want to write a method that only prints an array in the console, that does not return anything. My output is not in terms of a logical object. My output is more in terms of behavior. Okay, so what happens, how does my code behave when I execute it? Okay, so it's a void method because it does not return anything, and I'm gonna call it display array. Okay, so that's the name that I'm giving to this method. And again, because just like most of the major things in C#, I should have a pair of parentheses and a pair of curly braces. Okay, so I have my method signature. I don't have any errors in my code. So in terms of syntax, this is correct. However, let's think about this for a second. I'm writing a method to display an array. So if you ask me to go to the grocery store and buy something, okay, you're essentially, if we were to talk in programming terms, you're calling my method buy something, okay? But if you just ask me to buy something for you, you kind of have to specify what it is that you want to buy, right? You can't just call me up and say, hey, Louis, go to the grocery store and buy something, right? If you say that, my question will be, okay, so what do you want me to buy, right? So in that case, the stuff you want me to buy for you is the parameters to the method buy something. And it's kind of the same logic here. So if you're asking the code to print something or to display something, you have to specify what needs to be displayed. And you do that by using parameters. So if I want to display an array, maybe my parameter will be a string array, and I can just call it array. Okay, so, and again, keep in mind that this is a generalization, right? So what I'm doing here is I'm defining a method which is going to behave a certain way. It's going to have a behavior. What I want to do is I want to display something in the console. And if I want to display something, I have to be able to define what that something is. And to do that, I use parameters. And parameters are defined within the parentheses in the method signature. Okay, so what I can do from here is just cut this code and paste it here. Now, I don't have my base array here anymore, and that's because of scopes, right? That's just the way scopes work. So my days array, it exists within this scope, the scope of my main method, okay? When I declare a new method here, it has its own scope. So things that exist in one scope are not accessible in other scopes most of the time, okay? So this variable here, because it is defined within the scope of my main method, it's not accessible in any other method that I define within this class, or any other class for that matter. So what happens is that I have to remember that I am defining an array parameter here, and this is probably the array that I want to work with. So in that case, I don't have a days array, but I do have an array called array. And it's not a day, it's just a string. It could be a day, but it could also be anything else. So just call it element. And again, this is just a temporary name. You can call it whatever you want, okay? As long as it's a meaningful name and it means something to you, and it helps you and other people understand what you mean in your code, that is fine. So what I'm doing here essentially is I'm defining an array parameter, and for each element inside my array, I'm going to display that array in the console. Okay, that's essentially what I'm doing here. Okay, good. I have my method defined. What do I have to do now? I have to invoke it. If I just run this code, I won't really see anything, right? So let's run it. I want to show you that. Yeah, it doesn't really show me anything. Okay, that's because the method exists, it's defined, but it's never invoked. Okay, so let's invoke a method. And I can invoke one method from within another method. So how do I do that? Well, I can just go back into my main method, and I can just call my display array method. And look at that, IntelliSense even tells me that there is a method called display array. Good. Okay, so I'm getting an error. That's probably because in my method signature, I did say that my method receives a parameter. And I didn't pass a parameter into this method. So let's do that. Just gonna pass in my days array into that method. Okay, so my code has no errors. Let's run it. Let's see what I get. Cool. I get what I was looking for. I was looking for having all the array elements printed in a console, and that's exactly what I see. Good. And yeah, the code works. We learned how to create a method. We learned how to call a method or invoke a method, and that's good. That's very good. This display array method, however, is a method that only displays the array. It doesn't do anything specific with the array, so it never returns anything. That's why it's a void method. Not all methods, however, will be like that. Some methods will return something. So let's create a method that actually returns something. Again, signature is the same, public, static. This time it won't be a void method. It'll be a method that actually returns something. And now it's time for me to specify the data type that I have to return. Let's say I want to create a method that takes in an array of integers and doubles that array for me. It's going to look at each individual element and do element times 2. Okay, so that's what I want to try to accomplish. So if my method is supposed to take in an array of integers, then I'm supposed to double those integers and return an array. My return type for this method is an integer array. Okay? Essentially what I'm doing is whatever I used before to declare variables, I'm doing the same thing, except now I'm throwing the data type into my method signature. Okay? So if my method is supposed to return an int, it can return an int. If it returns an integer array, it returns an integer array just like that. Okay? So we just have to specify the data type the same way we have done so far. All right? And the next thing is the method name. So I'm just going to call it double array. Okay? I have my parentheses, I have my curly braces, which is good. Now, again, same logic applies, right? So if I'm asking my code to double something, I have to specify what that something is, right? Which means that I'm going to have parameters in my method. In this case, my parameter will be an array of integers, which I'm going to call array again. Or I can call it numbers just to use a different name. Okay? That's good. So I have my parameter. I think I have everything I need in my method signature. So let's go to the implementation. So what I want to do to that array is I want to go through each element. So I'll have to have a for loop. I'll call the numbers.length because I don't have to worry about knowing the number of elements that my array will have. I can just call the length property in it. And then what I want to do is numbers I is equal to numbers I times 2. Okay? So this is one of the ways that I can do that. Maybe I have paid attention to the other videos and I know that there's actually a shorthand for it. The shorthand is that. So this will automatically double it for me. Okay? So once I do that, okay, so it is doubled, so I can just return numbers. Okay. So what's happening here is that I'm receiving an array of integers. It's my parameter. I'm iterating over each and every element in that array, and I'm multiplying it by 2. Once I do that, all I'm going to do is return that array. Okay? And we are introducing a new keyword here. So the return keyword. And I have to use this keyword in methods that, guess what? Return something. So methods that are supposed to maybe grab a couple of numbers and add them up, or multiply them, or divide them. These are the kinds of methods that will return something to the user. Okay? And again, the user being the programmer who's consuming your methods, not the person who's actually using the program, the compiled program. So that's how the return keyword works. It will be present in methods that are supposed to return a value, a resulting value, to the person who is invoking that method. Okay? I think that makes sense. I hope it does. So let's say that now up here in my main method, I don't have an array of strings anymore. Let's say that what I have is an array of integers. I'm going to call it my numbers. And I'm going to initialize it to, I don't know, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. Okay? So what I'm going to do now is I'm going to call my double array. And I'm going to pass in my numbers as the parameters. Okay? Cool. So I think it's working, but if I run this code now, I won't really see anything. That's because I'm doing all the operations that I need, but I'm not displaying anything into the console. So this is no longer a string array. This is now an integer array that I'm working with. So that means this method has to be changed in order to accommodate for a new data type. And I can easily change that. It's no longer a string array. Now it's an integer array. So this is the first thing that I have to do in my code. The last thing is that now in my for each loop, each element in my array is no longer a string. Okay, it's actually an integer. So I have to change this data type too. All right. So, okay, cool. I don't get any errors anymore. So maybe it's time for me to call a display array method. I'm going to pass in what? What do I have to pass in there? That's a good question. So remember that this method here, it now returns something. Well, because it returns something, I actually have the ability to create a new variable, a new integer array variable, and I'm going to call it result. And my result will be equal to whatever the double array method returns. Okay? So that's how you work with methods that return something. And guess what? We have done it many times. For example, all those times where we had something like string input equals console.readLine. What we were doing is we were calling a method, the readLine method, that returns something, and it returns a string. If you just hover your mouse over the readLine method, you're going to see that Visual Studio shows you the method signature for the console readLine. And you can see that the return type is a string. That means the signature is probably similar to this one, although it does return a string instead. Okay, so because it returns a string, what we were doing is we were declaring a variable to receive that string and store it for us, right? So we are doing the exact same thing up here. So we're creating a new variable and we're calling a method that returns something. And whatever this method returns will be saved into the result variable. Okay? So now that I have my result variable, I can just pass it in as a parameter to my display array. So if I run this now, look at that, it actually works. So let's take a look at the result and compare with the code that we have. I'm declaring a numbers array and I'm initializing it to values 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, and the values that I get here are 2, 4, 6, 8, 10. So it appears that mathematically speaking my code is working. So why does it work? Well, I have my array and I have my result array, which is what I get back when I call method double array and pass in my numbers, which is my original array, as a parameter. So if I look into this method here, what it's doing is it's iterating over the array that I passed, and it's doubling all elements. It's multiplying times 2. Okay, and after it does that, it just returns the result, the whole array. And that's how I get the resulting array here in my result variable. Now that I have this result here, I'm calling my display array method. Okay, and when we look at the definition for the display array method, we see that it does receive an array as a parameter and we pass that in. And I have a for each loop that iterates over each element and prints it into a new line in the console. So what you can see from here is that the code that we have in the main method is much shorter. It's only 3 lines. Okay, and you can see that we have a method here, we have a method there. And these are small methods, so it doesn't really make a lot of difference. But if we were to have this code up here in the main method, my main method would be much bigger. Okay, it would be much bigger. And because we have methods, we are actually reducing the number of lines of code in my main method, which is good because it's more organized. It's easier to understand what's going on. Okay, and because you have your separate methods here and they actually have meaningful names, they actually tell you what they're doing, you don't really have to look at the method definition to understand what they're doing. For example, double array, well, I mean, it's kind of obvious that it takes in an array and it's going to do it times 2. When you call the display array method, it's kind of obvious that it'll somehow display the array to the user. That is why having meaningful names matter. Okay, adds readability, maintainability to your code, and that's the goal. Okay, so you can do so many things with methods, and I actually encourage you to explore and try some new things. See what are the things that you can do. What are the other possible data types that I can use for parameters? Can I define a method that does not take in any parameters? And I'll just tell you right away, yes, it is possible. So let's do an example like that. Let me get rid of this and that. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to create a new method. This will be our last example for this video. And I'm going to go ahead and say public static. I'm going to make it a void just because I can. And what I'm going to do here, let me close this for a second here. Yeah. I'm going to say greet. Okay, that's what I want to call this method. And this method is only supposed to do a console write line, say hello. That's all. Nothing fancy. Although methods in real life situations, methods will be a lot more complex than that. But this is only an example, so it's okay to keep things simple. So I have defined a method that does not return anything. It does not take in any parameters. So let me just invoke it. I don't get any errors because, well, this method does not expect any parameters. So everything appears to be correct. Let's run it. Yep. I get my hello message and yeah, it's good. So again, I encourage you to try all the different parameter configurations, all the different data type configurations, all the different return type configurations that you can have in your code. Do some exploration because methods, it's probably one of the greatest things that you will learn how to do in computer programming, and they are so important. Okay, so there are so many things to explore, and I do encourage you to do that. For example, can I define as many parameters as I need in my methods? Yeah, you can just do a comma separated list of parameters. Maybe you want to define a string array to be passed in afterwards. Call it strings. So yeah, you can. It is actually possible to have multiple parameters. Is it possible to have optional parameters? What if I don't necessarily have the user pass in a value for my array all the time? Maybe the user can choose not to pass in that parameter so that, you know, that parameter is optional, right? In other words, that's what it is. And it's okay, sometimes you're going to have methods with optional parameters. Maybe the user will choose to pass it in, maybe they won't. So how do you handle that kind of situation? Well, it's easy. Maybe you can just do something like that, equals null. Okay, so essentially what you're doing here is not only are you defining a optional parameter, but you're also defining a default value for a parameter. Okay, so there's so much to learn, and methods are just the tip of the iceberg. So do some research on it, explore, and learn all the different things that you can do with methods. And I think that's it for this video, and I'll see you all next time. Bye.